It all started with a message. "I'm leaving you for Ryan, taking everything from our account. Bye, loser," my wife wrote after 15 years of marriage. I, 42-year-old Trevor, stood in the kitchen of our home in Chicago, holding the phone shaking in my hands. But she didn't know that I had been preparing for this for months. Her infidelity was just the first act in a game where I would reveal all her dirty secrets and leave her with nothing. Trevor Blake, a 42-year-old home renovation contractor from the suburbs of Chicago, was scrubbing a stubborn coffee stain off the kitchen counter when his phone buzzed sharply against the granite. It was 7:32 p.m. on a chilly Tuesday in March 2025, and the house was quiet, too quiet. He realized later. He wiped his hands on a dish towel and glanced at the screen, expecting a work update or maybe a reminder from his calendar. Instead, the message that lit up his phone hit him like a punch to the gut. "I'm leaving you for Ryan. I've emptied our joint account. Good luck, loser. Bye." The sender? His wife of 15 years, Emily. Trevor stood there, the phone trembling slightly in his grip as he reread the words. His pulse thudded in his ears, but his face remained a mask of calm. The kitchen, with its gleaming appliances and framed photos of happier times, seemed to mock him. Emily's signature sarcasm, calling him a loser, with that casual cruelty he'd once found charming, cut deeper than he'd expected. But tears? Rage? Not yet. Instead, a slow, cold resolve began to simmer beneath the shock. She thought she'd blindsided him. She thought he'd crumble. She had no idea he'd been waiting for this. The signs had been piling up for months, little red flags he'd tucked away like receipts in a drawer. Emily, 39, had always been the vibrant one, blonde, sharp-witted, the kind of woman who could charm a room without trying. She'd worked as a marketing manager for a mid-sized firm downtown, a job she claimed demanded late nights and weekend strategy sessions. At first, Trevor believed her. He'd been busy himself, growing his small business, Blake's Home Solutions, into a steady operation that kept their mortgage paid and their lifestyle comfortable. But then came the changes. Her phone suddenly locked with a new passcode she wouldn't share, the faint scent of unfamiliar cologne on her coat, the way she'd started dressing younger. Tight jeans, bold makeup, a gym membership she flaunted like a trophy. "I'm just taking care of myself, Trev," she'd say with a laugh when he raised an eyebrow. "Don't you want me to look good?" 3 months ago, he'd found the first concrete clue, a crumpled receipt in the glove box of her car. Dinner for two at La Bella Vita, an upscale Italian place downtown, $187 with wine. Dated for a Thursday, she'd sworn she was stuck at the office. He'd held that slip of paper under the dim glow of the garage light, his stomach twisting, but he didn't confront her. Not then. Instead, he started watching, listening, planning. Emily's text wasn't a shock, it was confirmation. The joint account she'd emptied? He'd already suspected she'd try something like that. Months back, he'd quietly opened a separate account at a different bank, transferring most of his personal earnings there under the guise of business expenses. The joint account she'd raided held just enough to keep her from sniffing out his moves, about $8,000, a fraction of what he'd safeguarded. She'd taken the bait, thinking she'd cleaned him out. Trevor smirked faintly as he set the phone down on the counter. "Good luck, huh?" he muttered to the empty room. "We'll see who needs luck." He poured himself a glass of water, his hands steady now, and leaned against the sink, replaying the last year in his mind. Emily had met Ryan at the gym, he was pretty sure. The kid was 27, a personal trainer with a cocky grin and a TikTok following. The kind of guy who posted shirtless workout videos captioned with motivational drivel. Trevor had seen him once months ago, when he'd picked Emily up after a group class. Ryan had waved, all teeth and biceps, while Emily giggled a little too loudly at something he'd said. Trevor hadn't thought much of it then, just another meathead. Now it clicked. The betrayal stung, sure. 15 years of marriage, vacations in the Smoky Mountains, late-night talks over cheap wine, the time he'd rebuilt their deck with his own hands while she cheered him on, reduced to a smug text and a cleaned-out bank account. But Trevor wasn't the type to wallow. He'd grown up in a rough part of South Side Chicago, clawing his way out of nothing to build a life he was proud of. Emily might have forgotten that about him, but he hadn't. She'd started this game. He'd finish it. His phone buzzed again. Another message from her. Don't bother calling. Ryan and I are leaving for LA tomorrow. I'll send for my stuff later. Enjoy your sad little life. Trevor's jaw tightened, but he didn't reply. Instead, he pulled out his laptop and opened a folder labeled insurance. Inside were files he'd been compiling for weeks. Bank statements, screenshots, even a few blurry photos from a private investigator he'd hired on a hunch. Emily thought she'd played him. She didn't know he'd been holding the winning hand all along. Trevor Blake sat at the worn oak desk in his home office, the glow of his laptop casting sharp shadows across the room. It was just past midnight, hours after Emily's bombshell text had turned his world upside down. Or so she thought. The house was still, save for the faint hum of the furnace kicking on downstairs. He took a slow sip of black coffee, the bitterness grounding him as he opened the insurance folder again. This wasn't about panic or desperation. This was about precision. Emily had made her move. Now it was his turn to set the board. He'd suspected her for months, ever since that restaurant receipt had sparked a quiet alarm in his gut. Back then, he hadn't stormed into the bedroom demanding answers or hurled accusations over dinner. That wasn't his style. Trevor was a fixer. Give him a cracked foundation or a leaking roof, and he'd solve it methodically, step by step. A cheating wife? Same approach. He'd started small, casually asking about her late nights, noting how she deflected with a smile or a vague "work's crazy right now." When her excuses grew flimsier, he dug deeper. 6 weeks ago, he'd hired Rex Callahan, a private investigator with a grizzled voice and a reputation for discretion. Rex was an old high school buddy who'd traded football cleats for a PI license after a knee injury sidelined his college dreams. "You sure about this, Trev?" Rex had asked over beers at a dive bar on the edge of town. "Once I start, there's no unseeing what I find." Trevor had nodded, his jaw tight. "I need to know." Rex delivered. The first report came a week later. Photos of Emily and Ryan at a coffee shop, her hand brushing his as she laughed. A grainy shot of them slipping into a motel off I-94, her blonde hair unmistakable even in the dim light. The clincher was a time-stamped video from 2 weekends ago. Emily and Ryan in Trevor's own pickup truck, parked at a trailhead an hour outside Chicago, her head on his shoulder as they watched the sunset. Trevor had stared at that clip for a long time, not out of heartbreak, but to memorize every detail. Evidence was power. The financial piece fell into place next. Emily had always handled their joint account. She'd insisted on it years ago, claiming she was better with numbers. Trevor had let her, too busy with his business to micromanage. But when he'd logged into their online banking after the receipt incident, he'd noticed odd withdrawals. $200 here, $500 there, labeled as miscellaneous or consulting fees. She'd been siphoning money for months. He realized, small enough amounts to avoid suspicion, but they added up. Worse, he found a hidden account in her name linked to their family business, Blake & Company, Home Solutions. She'd been skimming profits, rerouting client payments to herself under fake invoices. His own wife was stealing from him. Trevor didn't confront her then, either. He played dumb, letting her think he was the oblivious husband she'd pegged him for. Instead, he'd opened a new account at First Midwest Bank, transferring most of his personal savings, nearly $60,000, under the radar. He'd kept the joint account active with just enough to match their usual spending. Groceries, bills, the occasional takeout order. Emily never noticed. She was too busy planning her grand escape with Ryan, too confident in her control. Now, as he scrolled through Rex's latest email, dated yesterday, Trevor felt a grim satisfaction. Attached were fresh photos. Emily and Ryan at a travel agency downtown, flipping through brochures for Los Angeles. A recorded call, too, courtesy of Rex's less-than-legal tricks. Emily's voice, smug and giddy, telling Ryan, "Once I drain that account, Trevor won't know what hit him. We'll be sipping cocktails in LA by Friday." The call was time-stamped for 17 p.m., hours before her text. Premeditation, clear as day. Trevor leaned back in his chair, rubbing the stubble on his chin. She'd emptied the joint account, $8,000 gone in a single withdrawal that afternoon, according to the bank alert he'd just checked. She probably thought she'd bankrupted him, left him scrambling. She didn't know about the separate account, the one he'd padded with every bonus and side job for months. She didn't know about the screenshots he'd taken of her fake invoices or the paper trail tying her to the business theft. And she definitely didn't know about Linda Voss, the shark of a divorce attorney he'd consulted 2 weeks ago. Linda had been blunt when they'd met at her sleek office in the Loop. "If she's cheating and stealing, we've got her dead to rights," she'd said, tapping a pen against her desk. "Get me proof, and I'll bury her in court. But you've got to be smart, don't tip her off." Trevor had handed over Rex's initial findings then. Now, he had even more. He fired off an email to Linda, attaching the new photos, the call recording, and a screenshot of Emily's text. "She made her move," he typed. "Let's make ours." His phone buzzed again, another taunt from Emily. "Pack my bags. Ryan says hi. Don't wait up." Trevor didn't flinch. He opened a browser, pulled up their joint credit card account, and smiled. A fresh charge. $3,200 for 2 first-class tickets to LAX, booked that evening. Another for a suite at the Beverly Hills Hotel, $1,800. She was using his card, not hers, to fund her little adventure. Perfect. He picked up the phone and dialed the bank's fraud line, his voice steady as steel. "This is Trevor Blake. I need to report unauthorized charges and cancel a card. I've got proof my wife's behind it. Texts admitting she's running off with my money. Can I forward them?" The rep didn't hesitate. "Send them over, sir. We'll handle it." Trevor hung up, forwarded the texts, and sat back. Emily and Ryan would hit the airport tomorrow, bags packed, dreams high, only to find their tickets voided, their hotel canceled, and their getaway grounded. He pictured her face, that smug grin fading to panic, and felt the first real spark of anticipation since her message had landed. This wasn't revenge yet. This was just the opening move. Trevor Blake woke up at 6 a.m., the gray Chicago dawn seeping through the blinds of his bedroom. The house felt emptier without Emily's clutter, her heels by the door, her half-read magazines on the coffee table. But he didn't mind. Last night's coffee still lingered in his system, fueling a quiet, focused energy as he pulled on a flannel shirt and jeans. Emily's texts had stopped after her snide "don't wait up" jab, but he knew she and Ryan were probably sprawled across some cheap motel bed by now, giddy with their imagined victory. They'd learned soon enough how wrong they were. He checked his phone, a confirmation from the bank. The credit card charges, $3,200 for flights to LA and $1,800 for the Beverly Hills Hotel, had been flagged as fraudulent and reversed overnight. The card itself was canceled, a dead end for Emily's spending spree. Trevor allowed himself a small, tight-lipped smile as he brewed a fresh pot of coffee. She'd used that card like a weapon, thinking she could bleed him dry while rubbing his nose in her betrayal. Instead, she'd handed him the first rope to hang her with. His lawyer, Linda Voss, called at 7:15, her voice crisp despite the early hour. "Got your email, Trevor? That recording of her bragging to Ryan? Gold. The texts admitting she emptied the account? Even better. She's digging her own grave. I'm drafting an emergency motion to freeze her assets, hers and the joint ones she thinks she's claimed. You ready to pull the trigger?" Trevor leaned against the counter, the mug warm in his hands. "Do it. She's leaving for LA today, or trying to. Let's make sure she lands hard." By 9 a.m., Linda had filed the motion with the Cook County Circuit Court, citing Emily's willful financial misconduct and attaching Rex's evidence. The photos, the call, the bank records showing her withdrawal of $8,000 from their joint account. Trevor added a cherry on top, forwarding the bank's fraud report to Linda, proving Emily had used the joint credit card post-text, a clear violation of trust. "She's not just leaving you," Linda said later, her tone almost gleeful. "She's committing textbook fraud. The judge will love this." Meanwhile, Emily and Ryan were on their way to O'Hare International Airport, oblivious to the storm brewing. Trevor pictured them, Emily in one of her new designer outfits, Ryan flexing in a too-tight tank top, their suitcases stuffed with dreams of Hollywood sunsets. They'd checked out of a budget motel near the highway, Rex had texted him a grainy photo of their exit at 8:30 a.m. and were likely sipping overpriced lattes at the terminal by now, waiting to board their 11 a.m. flight. Trevor didn't need to be there to know what came next. At 10:45 a.m., his phone buzzed with a text from Rex, who tailed them discreetly. There at the gate. She just tried to check in. Clerk's shaking his head. Tickets no good. She's pissed. Trevor chuckled, imagining Emily's face as the realization hit. The airline, alerted by the bank's fraud reversal, had voided their reservations. No first-class seats, no LA escape. A minute later, another text. Hotel called her. Bookings canceled too. Ryan's yelling about fixing this. Good luck, buddy. Trevor didn't reply. He didn't need to. The trap was springing shut. Emily's call came at 11:03 a.m., her voice shrill through the speaker. What the hell did you do, Trevor? Our tickets aren't working, the hotel's gone, and the cards declined. Fix it now. He let her rant, her words echoing off the kitchen tiles, before responding in a tone as flat as the Midwest plains. Fix it? You emptied our account and charged your little getaway on my card, M. That's fraud. I reported it. You're lucky I didn't call the cops, yet. She sputtered. You can't do this. That money's mine too. Trevor cut her off. Tell it to the judge. Bye. He hung up, silencing her mid-scream, and blocked her number. She'd figure out soon enough that begging wouldn't help. Rex's next update came at noon. They're stuck. Ryan's trying his card, maxed out. She's on the phone with someone freaking out. They're heading to a motel near the airport. Trevor nodded to himself. The $8,000 she'd taken wouldn't last long, not with her taste for luxury and Ryan's ego demanding a soft landing. Linda called again at 1:30 p.m. Emergency hearings set for tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Judge Kessler's presiding. He hates financial games like this. With her texts and the recording, we got a slam dunk to freeze everything she's got, including that secret account she's been stashing business funds in. You've got the business records ready. Trevor glanced at the stack of files on his desk, every invoice, every deposit, every dime Emily had rerouted from Blake and Company. Yeah, he said. She thought I didn't notice. I've got a year's worth. Good, Linda replied. She's toast. Oh, and Rex sent me something extra. Ryan's got a record. Minor stuff, fraud from a gym scam a few years back. She picked a real winner. Trevor snorted. Figures. Keep me posted. He hung up and walked to the window, staring out at the bare trees lining his street. Emily had underestimated him, thought he'd roll over while she and her gym rat boyfriend danced off into the sunset. She didn't know about the late nights he'd spent tracing her lies, the quiet calls to Rex, the way he'd turned her betrayal into a weapon. His phone buzzed one last time, not Emily, but a client, asking about a kitchen remodel quote. Trevor typed a quick reply, shifting gears. Life didn't stop, even when your wife tried to burn it down. Tomorrow, he'd face her in court, armed with proof and a plan. Tonight, he'd finish that quote and sleep like a man who knew he'd already won the first round. Emily and Ryan could stew in their motel room, plotting their next move. Whatever it was, Trevor would be ready. The Cook County Courthouse loomed gray and imposing under a drizzly Chicago sky as Trevor Blake climbed the steps at 8:45 a.m. He adjusted the collar of his navy blazer, nothing flashy, just sharp enough to signal he meant business, and carried a leather briefcase stuffed with the ammunition he'd spent months collecting. Inside, Linda Voss waited by the courtroom doors, her heels clicking against the marble as she waved him over. Judge Kessler's in a mood, she said, a glint in her eye. Emily's about to get a reality check. You ready? Trevor nodded, his jaw set. Let's end this. Emily arrived 10 minutes later, her blonde hair pulled into a messy bun, her designer coat wrinkled from a night in a cheap motel. Ryan trailed behind, his Jim Hone swagger replaced by a slump, his eyes darting like a cornered animal. They'd clearly scrambled after yesterday's airport fiasco. Rex had texted Trevor a photo of them checking into a budget place off the highway. Emily's face twisted in frustration. She spotted Trevor and shot him a glare that could have melted steel, but he met it with a cool, unflinching stare. She'd played her hand. Now he'd show his. Courtroom 3, was a sterile box of wood paneling and fluorescent lights. Judge Kessler, a wiry man with a no-nonsense frown, took the bench at 9 o'clock sharp. Linda wasted no time, launching into the emergency motion with the precision of a sniper. Your Honor, my client, Trevor Blake, seeks an immediate freeze on all marital assets due to Emily Blake's documented financial misconduct. She emptied their joint account of $8,000 via a single withdrawal, then used a shared credit card to book a $5,000 trip with her boyfriend, Ryan Carter, all while admitting her intent in writing. Linda slid a stack of papers across the table: Emily's texts, the bank records, Rex's photos, the fraud report. Emily's lawyer, a harried-looking guy in a cheap suit, probably hired last minute, stood to object. Your Honor, this is a marital dispute, not a crime. Mrs. Blake acted within her rights to shared funds. Kessler raised an eyebrow, peering over his glasses. Shared funds she bragged about stealing in a text message? I've emptied our joint account. Good luck, loser. That's your defense. The lawyer stammered, but Linda pounced. It's not just the account, Your Honor. Mrs. Blake siphoned profits from their family business, Blake & Company, into a hidden account. We have invoices, deposits, over $25,000 in the last year. Trevor watched Emily's face as Linda laid out the evidence. Her smugness cracked, replaced by a flush of panic. She whispered furiously to her lawyer, who tried again. Mr. Blake knew about the business account. It was joint income. Linda slid another file forward. Not according to the incorporation papers. Blake & Company is solely in Trevor's name, funded by his earnings. Mrs. Blake falsified invoices to divert funds. That's theft, not income. Kessler flipped through the documents, his frown deepening. This isn't looking good for your client, counsel. Then came the knockout punch. Linda played the recording Rex had snagged, Emily's voice, clear and cocky. Once I drain that account, Trevor won't know what hit him. We'll be sipping cocktails in L.A. by Friday. The courtroom went silent, the words hanging like smoke. Emily shrank in her seat, her hands twisting in her lap. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes fixed on the floor. Kessler leaned forward. Mrs. Blake, did you say this? She opened her mouth, then closed it, her lawyer muttering, No comment, Your Honor. Trevor took the stand next, his voice steady as he recounted the betrayal. The late nights, the lies, the receipt that started it all. I trusted her with our finances, he said, meeting Kessler's gaze. She used that trust to rob me blind while planning to run off with him. He nodded toward Ryan, who flinched. Linda handed up the final piece, screenshots of Emily's social media, where she'd posted cryptic updates like New Chapter, New Me, and a photo of a cocktail captioned Freedom Tastes Sweet, dated the day she'd sent the text. Emily's lawyer tried a desperate pivot. Your Honor, Mr. Blake's actions, canceling the card, stranding my client, show vindictiveness. Kessler cut him off. Vindictiveness? He reported fraud, as any reasonable person would. Your client's the one who emptied an account and booked a trip on his dime. That's not a defense, it's a confession. He turned to Emily. You have anything to say? She glared at Trevor, then muttered, He drove me to it. He was controlling, distant. Kessler raised a hand. Save it for the divorce hearing. Right now, I'm ruling on assets. The gavel came down at 10:15 a.m. All marital assets are frozen pending a full audit. Mrs. Blake, you're ordered to return the $8,000 within 48 hours, or face contempt. The business account in your name is seized. Mr. Blake retains sole control of Blake & Company. Next hearings in 2 weeks. Emily's jaw dropped, her lawyer scrambling to object. But Kessler was done. Courts adjourned. Outside, Trevor stood on the steps as Emily stormed past, Ryan trailing like a scolded puppy. You think you've won? She hissed. I'll fight this. Trevor shrugged. Go ahead. Keep digging. She froze, then spun away, but Ryan lingered, his voice low. She said she had millions stashed. I didn't sign up for this broke-ass mess. Trevor raised an eyebrow. Sounds like you picked the wrong sugar mama. Good luck. Ryan cursed and bolted after her. Linda clapped Trevor on the shoulder. She's toast. That recording? Her own words sunk her. And Ryan bailing? Cherry on top. Trevor nodded, watching them disappear into the drizzle. Emily's grand escape had crashed in under 24 hours, stranded, broke, and now facing a legal wall she couldn't charm her way past. He'd dismantled her plan piece by piece, and this was just the start. She'd underestimated him once. She wouldn't get a second chance. 6 months after the courtroom showdown, Trevor Blake stood in the renovated showroom of Blake & Company Home Solutions, the scent of fresh paint and sawdust mingling with a crisp October air drifting through the open door. The space, once a cramped garage workshop, now gleamed with polished floors and sleek displays of kitchen remodels and custom decks, testaments to the business he'd fought to protect. A small crowd of clients and neighbors mingled, sipping coffee and admiring his latest projects. The emergency hearing had been the turning point. Today was the victory lap. Emily's unraveling had been swift and spectacular. After Judge Kessler froze her assets and ordered her to repay the $8,000, she'd scrambled to comply, draining what little she'd squirreled away. The full divorce hearing 2 weeks later sealed her fate. Linda Voss had presented a mountain of evidence: Rex's photos, the falsified invoices, Emily's own damning texts, and the judge hadn't blinked. Trevor kept Blake & Company, his house, bought with an inheritance she'd had no claim to, and his separate savings. Emily walked away with her car, a maxed-out credit card, and a stern warning about future fraud charges. She'd tried one last plea, claiming Trevor owed her for emotional support during their marriage. Kessler had snorted, "Support doesn't include theft," and slammed the gavel. The fallout rippled fast. Ryan ditched her the day after the emergency hearing, texting Trevor later, via a mutual friend's phone, to whine. She lied about everything. "I'm out." Rex dug up more. Ryan had moved back to his mom's basement in Indiana, his gym gig tanking after clients heard about his role in the mess. Emily, meanwhile, holed up in a dingy studio apartment near the airport, her marketing job gone after her boss caught wind of the scandal. Her social media, once full of smug selfies, went silent, except for one cryptic post: "Karma's a bitch." Trevor had laughed at that, framing it next to her original "good luck, loser" text in his office. Irony was a hell of a decorator. Trevor hadn't stopped at survival. With Emily's claws out of his finances, he'd poured his energy into the business. Blake & Company landed a contract with a local developer, renovating 10 townhouses in Logan Square, and word of mouth brought a flood of new clients. Women especially sought him out, some for kitchen upgrades, others just to shake his hand and say, "I heard what you did. Good for you." A local paper ran a feature: "Chicago man turns betrayal into business boom." It wasn't the headline he'd expected at 42, but it fit. Emily's family reached out too, their tone a mix of shame and awe. Her sister, Jen, stopped by the showroom one rainy afternoon, clutching a coffee like a lifeline. "She told us you were the bad guy, controlling, cheap," Jen said, eyes on the floor. "Then we saw the texts, heard about the money. She screwed herself, not you." Trevor shrugged, polishing a sample countertop. "She made her choices. I made mine." Jen nodded, then added, "Mom's done with her. Said she raised her better than this." Trevor didn't reply. Their regret wasn't his burden to carry. The real surprise came a month ago. Emily showed up at his house, uninvited, disheveled, her coat threadbare. "I need help, Trev," she'd said, voice cracking. "I've got nothing, rent's due, no job. You owe me that much." He'd stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "I owe you? After you stole from me, ran off with that kid? You're lucky I didn't press charges." Her eyes welled up, but he saw the calculation behind the tears. "I made mistakes," she whispered. "Can't we work it out?" He shook his head. "You worked it out when you sent that text. Goodbye, Emily." He shut the door, her sobs fading as he walked away. Now at the showroom opening, Trevor scanned the crowd and felt something settle. Peace, maybe, or pride. His phone buzzed. Linda, with an update. "Emily filed another appeal, claimed you hid assets. Judge tossed it in 10 minutes. Fined her for wasting time. She's done." Trevor grinned, pocketing the phone. Done indeed. She'd gambled on breaking him and lost everything. Her cushy life, her boyfriend, her family's trust. He'd turned her betrayal into a springboard, proving he was more than the loser she'd mocked. A young couple approached, asking about a bathroom remodel. Trevor slipped into work mode, sketching ideas on a notepad, his hand steady and sure. Later, as the crowd thinned, he stepped outside, the city's skyline glinting in the distance. Emily was a footnote now, a lesson in trust and resilience. He'd rebuilt his life, better, stronger, while she floundered in the wreckage of her own making. 3 months ago, he'd found the first concrete clue, a crumpled receipt in the glove box of her car. Dinner for two at La Bella Vita, an upscale Italian place downtown, $1.87 with wine. Dated for a Thursday, she'd sworn she was stuck at the office. He'd held that slip of paper under the dim glow of the garage light, his stomach twisting, but he didn't confront her. Not then. Instead, he started watching, listening, planning. Emily's text wasn't a shock, it was confirmation. The joint account she'd emptied? He'd already suspected she'd try something like that. Months back, he'd quietly opened a separate account at a different bank, transferring most of his personal earnings there under the guise of business expenses. The joint account she'd raided held just enough to keep her from sniffing out his moves, about $8,000, a fraction of what he'd safeguarded. She'd taken the bait, thinking she'd cleaned him out. Trevor smirked faintly as he set the phone down on the counter. "Good luck, huh?" he muttered to the empty room. "We'll see who needs luck." He poured himself a glass of water, his hands steady now, and leaned against the sink, replaying the last year in his mind. Emily had met Ryan at the gym. He was pretty sure. The kid was 27, a personal trainer with a cocky grin and a TikTok following. The kind of guy who posted shirtless workout videos captioned with motivational drivel. Trevor had seen him once months ago, when he'd picked Emily up after a group class. Ryan had waved, all teeth and biceps, while Emily giggled a little too loudly at something he'd said. Trevor hadn't thought much of it then, just another meathead. Now it clicked. The betrayal stung, sure. 15 years of marriage, vacations in the Smoky Mountains, late-night talks over cheap wine, the time he'd rebuilt their deck with his own hands while she cheered him on, reduced to a smug text and a cleaned-out bank account. But Trevor wasn't the type to wallow. He'd grown up in a rough part of South Side Chicago, clawing his way out of nothing to build a life he was proud of. Emily might have forgotten that about him, but he hadn't. She'd started this game. He'd finish it. His phone buzzed again. Another message from her. "Don't bother calling. Ryan and I are leaving for LA tomorrow. I'll send for my stuff later. Enjoy your sad little life." Trevor's jaw tightened, but he didn't reply. Instead, he pulled out his laptop and opened a folder labeled insurance. Inside were files he'd been compiling for weeks. Bank statements, screenshots, even a few blurry photos from a private investigator he'd hired on a hunch. Emily thought she'd played him. She didn't know he'd been holding the winning hand all along. Trevor Blake sat at the worn oak desk in his home office, the glow of his laptop casting sharp shadows across the room. It was just past midnight, hours after Emily's bombshell text had turned his world upside down. Or so she thought. The house was still, save for the faint hum of the furnace kicking on downstairs. He took a slow sip of black coffee, the bitterness grounding him as he opened the insurance folder again. This wasn't about panic or desperation. This was about precision. Emily had made her move. Now it was his turn to set the board.